This week on the show, we'll cover OpenBSD's defensive approach to OS security. We help you understanding Syscall conventions for different platforms. We also show you how mishandling SMTP Sender Verification can work, how the cd command actually works, and a Lua bootloader coming to FreeBSD in this week's episode of BSD Now. BSD Now, episode 236, How a CD Works, recorded for the 7th of March 2018. Hello, I'm your host, Benedikt Reuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
Welcome to our episode this week. We are actually not here where we're supposed to be normally, but we're at Asia BSDCon having the time of our lives as usual. But we couldn't get it over with producing a show earlier, so you get the recording for this one, and next week we're back, and then we'll cover all the cool things that happened at the conference.
Yes, we wouldn't leave you high and dry with no episode.
Yeah, craving for the BSD Now weekly dose. Let's go into our headlines this week. It's about Pledge. There's OpenBSD's defensive approach to OS security. Sounds interesting.
So this is... the meaning of pledge is the same as in the real world. That is a solemn promise or undertaking. So in OpenBSD, calling the pledge syscall in a program means to promise that the program will only use certain resources from that point on. So how does that make a program more secure? It limits the operations of a program. Example, you write a program named ABC that only needs to read and write to files or print something to the screen. You add pledge and say you're only going to use standard input and output or whatever. And then if you attempt to use anything beyond that, it will crash the program. That way, a malicious user found that there's a vulnerability in your program which they could exploit and maybe get a shell. But because exploiting your program to open a shell will result in violating that pledge that you had made, that the program had made, it will get a SIG abort from the kernel, and the program will abort and not run, and it will generate a log, which the sysadmin will be able to see. This happens because executing any other code in your program where you've pledged that you won't do that breaks the promise and results in your program being punished for it. But opening a shell or root shell with will make those other syscalls that are not allowed. So unlike some previous attempts, like, do you remember what the thing before pledge was called? It was years and years ago. Kristaps wrote it, I think.
Something like, can't recall right now.
Yes. Anyway, they had a syscall filter before, but it turned out to be problematic. So in the end, it's not used to restrict system calls per se. In this case, it is actually groups of privileges and controlling them. So instead of, say, read or write, because you could do read and write on a socket or a file or the standard input and output and so on, Pledge works on these subsets, like allowing DNS but not other connections and so on. As such, promises are not system calls directly, but are more easier to understand groups of system calls and so on.
Okay.
They have quite a bit more detail here in the article if you're interested in reading about it. In particular, they've added the new exec promise thing. So currently, the problem with Pledge was if your program actually did need to execute something else and you allowed that, the child process you created had no pledges. Because the way Pledge works is generally a program needs some administrative authority at the beginning, otherwise it's not a privileged program, right? But generally it can do what it needs the privileges for quickly at the beginning, And then after that, it enters its main loop where it's just reading and writing data to the screen or whatever, and doesn't need the privileges anymore. So pledge works by doing the dangerous stuff, then making the pledge and locking yourself in this little sandbox so that you can't break anything. And this reduces the attack surface because generally exploits in the program come by the input you're reading from the user and doing stuff. And if you've given up all your admin privileges already, you don't have this problem. However, if you exec another program or another copy of yourself, you want to be able to do those administrative actions that are required at startup. So you don't want the pledge to apply to the child. But at the same time, by not making that work, there was kind of a hole where if the exploit could cause your program to fork something else or exec some other program, it would then have all the privileges and not be pledged at all. So with the new exec promises, this allows you to make a separate set of promises for the child process. So maybe allow more things so that the critical things can happen, but still have some restrictions that way. There's also a new small feature called error, which causes violating system calls to just return -1 and set error node to eNoSys rather than killing the process. This can be dangerous because if the program doesn't actually check the return value of the system call it was trying to do, and therefore doesn't know that it failed, it thinks it's succeeded, and it continues on doing something as if that other resource is there or that other action happened, even if it didn't. And it can cause the program to act really strange. But
certainly,
it can be a bit of a way to bridge the gap as you're working on the adjusting the pledge set for the application to make it work in the sandbox. Although oftentimes having the process be killed with the SIG abort can generate a core dump, and then you can walk through the program and figure out why it was doing the thing it shouldn't have been doing.
Yeah, to figure out the problem where it didn't work out.
Yeah, so they say the error parameter is being introduced for a different reason. The pre-exec process's expectation of what a post-exec process will do might mismatch. So error allows things like starting an editor, which has no network access, or maybe even other restrictions in the future. Right, so if you're starting the editor and you didn't give it access to the network, and it tries to use the network, it will fail. Hopefully the program will deal with that, and you can still edit a text file. Anyway, it's a pretty good summary of what Pledge is and how it works and how some of the new stuff applies. So if you're interested in Pledge, you should check out this article over at medium.com.
Yep, and try out some of the examples. So we're having a little bit more pledgy programs, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
All right, our next story is every journey starts with a fail, or understanding Syscall conventions for different platforms. So this sounds interesting enough to cover it in the show. And this is over at k3research.outerheaven.de, German website. Excellent, but the article is in English, so let me cover this for a while. So not long ago, it starts, the blog writer here started looking into FreeBSD kernel exploitation. There are only a few resources, but probably the best starting point is ArcP's FRAC article from 2009. And while he does only provide one technique, he wanted to understand it and port it to a modern FreeBSD release before describing new owned research techniques. Well, at this time, this was his plan. In reality, he ended researching different operating systems, respectively the same operating system, but for different architectures implementing syscalls. Hence, new exploiting methods have to wait for another post. In this one, he wanted to describe his personal fail while porting ArcP's exploit example to a FreeBSD 11.1 release running on a 64-bit processor. Maybe this will give other people or that are interested in kernel stuff, some insights they didn't know before. If you already know how syscalls work on 32 and 64-bit BSDs because you are an experienced exploit or kernel developer, you will probably want to search for something else to read. Moreover, some of the debugging stuff can look laborious because he wanted to show the steps he had done while attacking his problem instead of showing a simple walkthrough to the solution. So the problem here is ArcP described in this article vulnerable code consisting of a loadable kernel module which exposes a syscall to the user land. Because it was written around the time when FreeBSD 8 release came out long ago, because he was written that himself that the code needs smaller adjustments to work with this version. Which was written for FreeBSD 7. So, we go back in time here. So he thought this would be his first port to FreeBSD 11. Moreover, it was written for an Intel 32-bit processor architecture, and we can see from his shellcode examples here that this is that was his experience at least. Hence, he wanted to go right away to the harder part and modify it to work on a 64-bit processor. So why the original code worked while it was wrong, as written above, the Syscall convention for the 32-bit architecture is different from the one for the 64-bit. Indeed, a syscall on a 32-bit FreeBSD system passes the arguments via the stack with the syscall offset is stored in the EAX register. So the transfer into the kernel address space is done in CPU_fetch_syscall_args. in sys i386/i386/trap.c. So that's where you can find all these. And we find a code example here. So that's giving you an idea how this might work. This is a much simplified example. It's not how the actual code looks, but to understand the article better, that's a little bit trimmed down. So what do we see here, Alan? This is basically the actual syscall I was talking about, CPU_fetch_syscall args. And that takes a thread structure pointer. My coding skills don't leave me right now. And then a pointer to struct syscall args. And that basically initializes the frame and goes to, checking the parameters, whether they have the exact size and such.
Basically looping over calling copy in to copy the data from user space into the kernel.
Yeah, right, in that if statement. All right, so that is param points to ESP plus 4 bytes offset, and later the arguments are copied into the kernel space, which is referred to by SA pointer to args. Args is an array of 8 register_t pointers or types, which is defined as int32_type on the 32-bit platform in comparison to the 64-bit platform. And as struct args only consists of integers, they got copied into the syscall arguments, which are given to the trigger function inside the kernel module. We could verify this by changing int op to long op in the kernel module and in trigger.c. So we get the following output doing that. So here's the trigger output here. So that looks like something we should compare next. However, where was I? Here. Really? Yeah. Yeah. To bring this to an end, ArcP's version only worked for the special choice of arguments and only on 32-bit. On the 32-bit FreeBSD platforms, the arguments are transferred into kernel space by 4-byte integers. Hence, it will only work for integers anyway. On 64-bit FreeBSD platforms, we have to use syscall and in the intended way. So the article goes a little bit more into detail. If you read the whole thing, you get a much better understanding of what we talked about.
Yep. They also note that on Linux, on 32-bit platforms, it does use the CPU registers and not the stack to transfer syscall arguments into the kernel space. That is, just uses a struct to transfer arguments. Doesn't actually work like it does on FreeBSD.
Okay, good.
This week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by IX Systems. Head over to ixsystems.com/BSD Now and get in touch with them about your hardware needs. So I placed an order last night, as I seem to be doing more and more frequently nowadays.
You're running out of disk space again?
Yeah, actually, running out of disk space again. And so I had them break down the cost per terabyte for so different size disks, and it turned out it is now much more economical to go with the 12 terabyte helium-filled SAS disks than to continue to buy 6 terabyte disks. Part of the reason for this for us is we only have so many slots left in the chassis. If we keep filling them with 6 terabyte disks, we'll be out of space and we'll have to buy another chassis. Whereas if we take the 20 slots we have left and fill them with disks that are twice as big, we'll go twice as long before we have to buy another chassis. But I also took advantage of the fact that IX custom built all of my machines for me. It also means they know what all of my machines are. So I give them the it's not really a serial number, but the ID for my server that they built me. And I was like, so I'm planning to do this. And they're like, okay. And they updated their records so they actually know where I put these disks. You know, they didn't do like, oh, you're just ordering more disks, we'll ship them to you and not think about it. They actually know which machines those disks are going into, and that will help them make better suggestions to me in the future too.
Yeah,
actually, we're doing a little bit of a dance here. We're going to take, so we have a primary server in the main data center, and that's got 36 6 terabyte drives in the machine, and then it's got a separate storage shelf, which currently has 24 6 terabyte drives in it, giving us 60 6 terabyte drives. The backup machine is actually a bit smaller. It had 24 5 terabyte drives and then a shelf and 24 6 terabyte drives, leaving it like 90 terabytes smaller. This becomes a problem. As the main one gets full, the backup can't hold all the backups. And it complicated things for us. So we're going to swap out 12 of the 24 5 terabyte disks in the chassis of the backup server for 12 terabyte disks. That will more than double what those space were, but it will mean that that machine will now only be about 10 terabytes behind the primary machine, meaning our backups we'll be able to back up more of the machine without having to try to shuffle some of the backups onto another machine or something. And then those 5 terabyte disks, because they're still pretty new, will actually be swapped into a different machine that is full of 12 3 terabyte disks. So it'll get an upgrade too as part of this whole scheme. I might have to blog a little bit about doing this because in addition to all that, we're also adding more of these 12 terabyte drives to both the primary and the backup in the sled. Right, the sled holds 44 disks and has currently got 20 in it. So that means there are 24 in it. So there are 20 slots left at the backup and 20 slots at the primary. So we actually bought 32 of these 12 terabyte disks, 12 to upgrade the backup's main server, and then 10 each to expand the storage of each of those 2 sleds. But in order to swap out the drives, there are 24 drives in the front of the backup server, and we're going to swap out 12 of them. If you did this by, swap out one hard drive with a bigger one, let it resilver, then do the next one, and the next one, it would take 12 iterations of doing that, and each one would take like half a day or more to do the resilver because they're full. That would probably take a while and be a lot of work and just increase risk while it happens of a disk failure or whatever. So we're actually going to put 10 of the 12 new disks in the storage chassis, the shelf, so they can be online at the same time. So we can do 10 concurrent ZooPool replaces and replace a bunch of the 5 terabyte disks with the 12 terabyte disks and do that. So they can, all that resilvering can happen concurrently with both the old and new disks online. So there's no, we're not actually losing any of the redundancy. And it'll be faster because we won't have to do parity calculations to figure out what the data should have been. It can copy it off the real disk, but it will obviously checksum it as it does it and make sure it's right and can use parity if it's not. But it will get 10 of the 12 disks replaced much more quickly. Then we replace one at a time of the other two or something.
Wow. And originally when you bought that system from IX Systems, you didn't think you could expand it that far, but you planned ahead to have that.
When we bought the backup machines, we figured 24 5 terabyte hard drives, that'll last forever. It'll be fine. We don't need to think about this anymore. And now we're looking at the one and we're like, that's going to be how many terabytes? 400 terabytes in each of these two machines? It's just...
Yeah, it's unimaginable back then, but it's now reality. So,
and it's like, when we bought the shelf, we purposely bought the controller card such that we could add a second shelf if we need. And it's like,
just in case.
44 drives. It's like,
wow.
At some point, it's like, we could swap some of the 6 terabytes for 12s, but then we have to find something to do with the 6s. And it's like, or we could just keep adding more disks.
Just shove it.
Yeah. But all of the disks. But, it was actually interesting. I was talking about this in one of the, FreeNAS channel. And somebody was like, when you're ordering 32 disks at once, do you order a couple of extras in case some of them are dead on arrival? I'm like, if I was buying from a regular vendor, I might have to do that. But it's IX. They're going to test the drives for me first.
Yeah.
And not only test them, because they tested them, they already had to put them in the hot swap trays. So they leave them already in the hot swap trays, which means when they get here, I'm not going to have to put in 6 times 32 tiny little screws and get all these drives mounted. I can just start plugging them into the chassis right away.
Yeah, that makes a total difference as a customer to just plug it in. And
especially if one of these machines was like a lot of our others and was remote. If I'm having to pay someone hundreds of dollars an hour for remote hands in a remote data center, I don't want to be paying them to put screws in hard drives. I want them to be plugging them in the right order and then being done in 15 minutes. Not spending 3 hours putting screws in for me. That's not what I want to be paying for.
So you're saying IX Systems is not screwing you in this regard?
Yeah, I'd say that they're going the extra mile and making my life easier. And to me, that would be worth extra money. But it turns out they were also cheaper than I could get the hard drives elsewhere. So I was double happy.
Sure. And for people with a little... smaller budget,
more modest needs.
They can start with a FreeNAS Mini. They can pick a 4-bay one or an 8-bay one.
Mini XL and get 8 drives because, the one thing you will find is that you will always eventually run out of space.
Yeah, and you might as well have a little bit more headspace rather than just having to buy a whole new chassis to fit more disks in. Mm-hmm. So that's what IX Systems built you.
You just said this, so I'm now picturing a little FreeNAS Mini with the card and an external cable going to a giant 4U shelf.
I need to sync my data.
It's just like this little design for under your desk at home appliance and then wired into a giant data center thing. It's blowing my mind here.
That's possible because IX Systems knows what they're doing and they're using ZFX extensively in their storage systems, which is a good solution because then you can sleep easily knowing that your data is secure.
Yes, and more than just the hardware, IX Systems is also responsible for the software, like FreeNAS and TrueNAS and TrueOS. And so they have a blog post over here about the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which goes into effect in less than 3 months.
In Europe?
The FreeNAS and TrueNAS storage managers at companies of all sizes need to be thinking about their compliance with these new regulations. And so they're talking about how FreeNAS and TrueNAS can help you gain compliance with these and keep up to date with the requirements with these new regulations.
And IX Systems is already thinking about how it affects them and the customers in the EU, because sometimes it's like, there was this new regulation introduced 6 months ago and it's going to be in effect tomorrow. And has anyone thought about the ramifications? And certainly not many people have at this point because they just heard about it. But IX Systems is already ahead of the curve. They think about how to make that easier for their customers in the EU, especially when it concerns the data protection and that you need to collect only as much data as you need or as little as you need. So that's important, not just for EU people, but also for people who send or sell stuff to the EU or store data in the EU or from EU citizens and things like that. Read the whole blog post. It's written by Michael Dexter, and then you know what the issue is.
Yep, they have a detailed article there if that applies to you and you need to learn more.
Yep. So check out IX Systems, and don't forget to check out the IX Systems / BSD Now, where you can find a little PDF that tells you what you should look up for in your open source hardware vendor when you're in the market for a new server.
Yep.
All right, going on with the show, we have something new from our good friend Peter Henstein. It's been a while since we covered a blog post from him, but this one is a live lesson in mishandling SMTP Sender Verification.
Yes. So this was his attempt to report spam to a mail service provider's abuse address, reveals how incompetent they are sometimes distinguishing valid reports from malicious attempts. So it says it all starts with one of these rare spam mails that get through his filtering. This one was hawking address lists, much like the ones I occasionally receive to address that I can not turn into spam traps. The message was addressed to, of all things, root at one of his machines. The message with full headers has been preserved for future reference. But he says, yes, that's right. They sent their spam to root at. And a quick peek at the headers revealed that, like most of these attempts at hawking address lists for spam that actually make it to a mailbox here, it was one being sent by an Outlook.com customer. The problem with spam delivered via Outlook.com is that you can't usefully blacklist the sending host because they're one of the largest online mail providers. And a large chunk of the world uses Microsoft-hosted email solutions like Office 365, and having their usually legitimate mail delivered via that very same infrastructure. And he says, and since Outlook.com is one of the mail providers that doesn't play well with graylisting, it spreads retries out over a lot of different subnets so that each one looks like a unique attempt rather than regular graylisting. It's fairly common practice to just whitelist all of those networks and avoid the hassle of lost or delayed mail from Microsoft customers. So he was going to just ignore the message, but there seem to be an increasing number of these spammy outfits taking advantage of Outlook.com's status as unblockable, basically, and using that to get into people's mailboxes. Mm-hmm. So he decided to try both to do his best to demoralize this particular sender and alert Outlook.com to the problem. I wrote a message that he's also preserved for you and CC'd it to abuse@outlook.com, where basically we're saying the address root at his machine has never been subscribed to any mailing lists for obvious reasons. Whoever sold you this address list and the addresses on it are criminals and should at least demand your money back. To whoever handles abuse@outlook.com, will appreciate the attachment, which is a copy of the message I just received with all the headers intact. But it's what happened next that's actually quite amazing. If my analysis is correct, it may not be possible for senders who are not themselves Outlook.com customers to actually reach Outlook.com's abusive team. Any student or practitioner of the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol should know that SPF records should only happen on ingress. That is, at the point where mail traffic enters your infrastructure and the sender's IP is the original one. Leave the check for later when the message may have been forwarded and you do not have sufficient data to actually perform the check. whenever I encounter incredibly stupid and functionally destructive configuration errors like this, I tend to believe it's down to a simple incompetence and not malice. But this one has me wondering. If we essentially require incoming mail to include the contents of spf.outlook.com, which is currently no less than 81 different subnets, as valid senders of the domain, you are essentially saying that only Outlook.com customers are allowed to email Outlook.com. If that restriction is a result of a deliberate choice rather than a simple configuration error, this probably moves out of the technical sphere and could conceivably become a legal matter, depending on what Outlook.com have specified in their contracts when they're selling to their customers. But let us assume that this is indeed a matter of simple bad luck or incompetence rather than a technical problem. So he said, I would like to report, or I would have liked to report this to whoever does technical things at that domain by email, but unfortunately there's indications that being their customer is a precondition of doing that. But they hope to fix that soon and move on to terminating their spammy customers' contracts. The main reason to be learned from this is that when you're shopping around for email servers, do yourself a favor and make an effort to ensure that the provider actually do modern-ish things like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and that they actually work. Otherwise, you might end up with more mail that you don't want, and that your own mail may end up getting not delivered.
Yep. I mean, for these newsletters, it's just they have usually these unsubscribed links, and typically you would go, yeah, if I unsubscribed it, and they now have confirmed that there's actually a person behind that email address.
Yeah, this wasn't a newsletter. This was spam trying to sell you lists of people for you to spam.
Yeah, that's a totally different approach here. But yeah, certainly.
Not only are you spamming me, but you're accusing me of being a spammer, basically.
Yeah, putting me into your net of spamming. Yeah, certainly strike back at those people. They should not be allowed to continue their malicious activity. So, time for the news roundup this week. Starting with running salt proxy minions on OpenBSD. So salt proxy minions, for those who have never heard of these, this is the salt stack system for system configuration, basically where you can say, you know, I want to manage this 100 machines or thousands of machines with just, click of a button. And that's pretty much a contender to what you probably have heard about from Chef or from Puppet or Ansible, if you like. So this is a proxy minion for salt, and it's running on OpenBSD apparently. So we have here in this blog post written that as the blog writer or the author has had previously attempted several times in the past, he's finally very close to switching to OpenBSD, a more stable and reliable operating system that he likes. Before starting to make the actual change on both personal and work computers, he started testing some of the tools he's currently using and understand what the expectations are, which is good because you just don't want to migrate from like now to the other system without testing everything first. That would typically not go well. So in general, he didn't encounter issues, or when he did, found the answers in the documentation, which is really good, or various forums. He didn't find, however, any questions regarding proxy minions on OpenBSD, which is why he thought it might be helpful to share his experiences. So installation and startup goes like this. With these said, he started playing with Salt, and it was simple and straightforward. First step is to install Salt. This is on OpenBSD. This is package_add salt. This will pull in the needed dependencies, of course, and this will bring the ports that you need, like the Python futures, 0MQ, the SFQ, or Tornado, which are needed for salt. This will all be fetched down so that you have it on your box. And after configuring the pillar_root in the etc salt /master, the config file there for the master is the thing where you basically start where all your pillars are. He started up with the master process using rcctl. And starting up the proxy minions is easy as well. The salt package for OpenBSD comes with the RC file for salt proxy, etc rcds salt_proxy. And while typically you can run a singular minion on a given machine, it's very likely that there are multiple proxy processes. Additionally, the default salt RC file has the following configuration for the salt proxy daemon, and that's listed here. So all the examples are right in the blog. Next, starting many proxy minions. So you have managed to start up a proxy minion, but what about many? So one isn't enough, of course. Executing 3 commands above for each and every device is tedious and cannot scale very well. He thus has to figure out the following way. That's also detailed here. And after that, he has a separate RC file per proxy, each having the daemon instruction explicitly specifying its minion ID. So you start the service using the regular minion that controls the machine where the proxy processes are running, and the test proxy minion is then up, and after accepting the key, like salt key -a, it will talk to the master. Extending the same to a very large number of proxy minions, you can easily manage the RC files and start the services using salt state executed on regular minion. That's detailed here. And using the file.managedState function to generate the contents of the RC file for each proxy with its own minion ID. See, you're already using salt itself to manage itself, or at least the proxy minions. And using the service.runningstate functions as a start service. So, of course, anytime you make a change to a config file, you need to restart the service, typically. These 2 steps would suffice to start an arbitrary number of proxy minions, and the command executed will always be the same regardless how many processes you aim to manage. And he concludes with, he's still a novice when it comes to OpenBSD. He has plenty to learn, but it looks like the transition will be much smoother than he expected, and he's already looking forward to the handover, and most importantly, he will no longer be using systemd. Yes, if that's a goal, then typically this is a good way to start. Yeah, so people who want to check out SaltStack in general, this is a good starting point, not just for OpenBSD itself, but also other BSDs who want to get into proxy minions. This is typically how you set up your system. The configuration is not very system dependent anyway.
Yep. So in our next story, we have an update from Werner Losch about the Lua bootloader. So as you may know, Lua is a scripting language, and there was a Google Summer of Code project back in 2014 to use Lua as the scripting language in the bootloader to make it easier for people to customize the menus and the other functionality of the bootloader. And so that started in 2014. And the student Pedro Souza was mentored and worked on it. Then later, Rui Palo, a FreeBSD committer, created a SVN project branch to try to integrate it into FreeBSD, but that eventually stalled out when he ran out of time to work on it. So Werner has rebased that effort onto a GitHub branch where another user, Pedro Arthur, picked it up and worked on it. And over the past year, I've been cleaning up the bootloader for various other reasons and other parts of the bootloader. So Werner moved all the boot code from sysboot to /stand in the root and cleaned up a lot of old copy and paste and other terribleness I encountered while working on the Gellyboot stuff. And some of the terribleness that I created while working on the Gellyboot stuff. And he found it time was ripe to start integrating Pedro II's work into the tree. However, those integration efforts had taken a while as his day job work on the bootloader took priority. In the meantime, EdMast and the FreeBSD Foundation funded one of their co-op students, Zachary Nevzinger, to enhance the original Google Summer of Code Lua scripts to bring it closer to parity with the evolution of the 4th menu in the meantime. Basically, since 2014, we've added quite a bit of functionality to the bootloader, including support for ZFS boot environments. And so the Lua code needed to get caught up. But luckily, the co-op student was able to do that. So Werner says he's pleased to announce that all of these threads of development have converged, and they'll be publishing the FreeBSD Lua bootloader. So that's in the tree now, and it currently lives side by side with the 4th loader. So the loader that uses Lua as its scripting language will be available instead of Forth. While coexistence is planned, the timeline for it is still a bit rough. So if you want to try it today, you can compile your system with the flags without Forth equals yes, and with loader Lua equals yes. And then, fortunately, you needn't do a full world install to do this. You can just build source stand and install the results, and be sure to maybe keep the old one around in case you need to fail back.
Bootloaders are kind of important, yeah.
Yeah. So this will replace /boot/loader and its Forth scripts with the Lua version. It will install the Lua scripts into boot/Lua. The boot is scripted with the boot/Lua/loader.lua script instead of loader.rc. You're strongly advised to keep a backup copy of the Forth version of bootloader so that you can use the boot2 menu. So if you've ever been hammering the escape key to cancel Pixie Boot or something and dropped into that little like 2-line menu where it asks you just boot : and expects you to type out a path that comes up before the loader menu, that's actually boot2, and that's where you can specify a different loader if you really need to. And so you would just specify, /boot/loader.forth or whatever you called your backup, and it will boot the old way. Or you can use a USB stick to boot and replace the loader with one that works and get back into your system. Quite a bit of work has been going on in this in the last couple of weeks. I know Kyle Evans and Conrad Meyer have been firing up scripts like crazy. I think almost all of the functionality that existed in the Forth loader has been implemented in Lua, and some new features, including what I had been working on for Forth, but it was pretty nasty, and I much rather the way they did it in Lua, where the menu that lets you select which kernel to boot will auto-detect all the installed kernels rather than just knowing about kernel and kernel.old. This will become even more important as part of the package-based setup, where package will automatically keep the last 5 or so kernels on your system around in case the new one doesn't work and you can boot the old one and so on.
Yeah, that's super important, and I come to relying on that because you can mess up kernels, and then you're like, I wish I had my own system back.
To boot will be quite handy.
Yeah, so I'm very happy that this is happening, actually. Yeah.
Especially since Lua is much more approachable. So adding extra stuff to the menu will get so much easier. And I think that will make it much more approachable. And I say, well, it's possible to build all of the bootloader variants with Lua. We've just been testing the BIOS booted version and without menus, although I think the menu stuff is mostly ready now. And they will start testing some of the other variants like the Pixie booted one and the UEFI one. And they're hoping to have that too. And then
there's a bit of work left, but I guess more people are joining this effort now. I see a couple of commits go by with something Lua related in it, so I think this is going to be popular very soon.
And so Warner also notes that he set the MFC for this to when to copy it in the stable 11 branch to a month due to the heroic, or dare I say almost crazy work of Kyle Evans to merging all of the other revisions and all of Warner's other work from current to stable 11. I'm planning to MFC to 11 after the coexistence issues have been hammered out so that both Forth and Lua will be able to exist at the same time and it'll be easier for users to choose. In 11, Forth will remain the default and Lua will be an option. That'll just be a matter of renaming the files or choosing it at the boot2 menu. Whereas in 12, the goal is that eventually Lua will be the default. But Forth will still be available, and then maybe that'll go away in 13.
Cool. So maybe the
nice thing is it does sound like this will be an option in FreeBSD 11.2, with a release schedule for which we'll be talking about in a little bit later in the show. But the bootloader won't change drastically out from under you if you're upgrading from 11.1 to 11.2, but in 12, it sounds like we'll get all the new goodness by default. But it will be available to you in 11.2 if you would like to use it.
And maybe the snapshots will also contain this at one point.
Yes, all the 12 snapshots will have it enabled by default as soon as it's enabled by default in the repo. It is important that people test this because the number of random issues you can run into from different hardware means that we really want to make sure this works on all the machines if it's going to be the default in 12.
Yeah, the more testing we get, the more bugs will be found earlier before there are any releases with this.
This week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by DigitalOcean. Head over to digitalocean.com and you can get a FreeBSD virtual machine in the cloud running in less than a minute.
Yeah, with a snap, you just decide what kind of droplet size you want to have. That means what number of CPUs or how big your memory should be or what kind of SSD storage space option you need. Then you pick those, set a couple of options, and then you spin up that VM. It's super fast and it's available to log in right after that.
Yeah, you just pick which one you want, what OS you want. You want FreeBSD with UFS or ZFS, and boom, it's up and going, and you start paying by the hour. The smallest instance starts at just $5 or 0.7 cents an hour. So that's less than a penny. And so they're great for testing stuff or playing with things and whatever. And they include lots of internet transfer. Even the $5 one includes a terabyte of bandwidth. And the $10 one includes 2 terabytes.
Yeah, that's what most people don't even scratch in their typical use. But once you get your little droplet, then you say, it works so well, maybe I can add this other service, or I can put this into the cloud, or this other thing. So the number of machines grow over time, or that one machine that you have is not going to be idle that long. It's just adding more features to it.
Yes, and it's possible to dynamically size them up to bigger ones with just a reboot too. So you can be like, turns out I need more RAM. I'm going to switch to an optimized droplet and get 4 gigabytes of RAM or whatever. Or they have the flexible droplets that are the same size but allow you to switch the amount of RAM or number of CPUs to find whatever fits you best for the same price.
Yeah, and if you ever wanted to know how to run certain things in the cloud in a distributed way, then check out their community session that has a lot of tutorials written by users or mostly by users who are using their infrastructure already, and they can tell you things like how to set up a proper distributed microservices deployment or things like DigitalOcean backups in their cloud or how to set up a WordPress blog. This is all in their community section.
Yep. Or if you need more storage space, the storage that comes with the droplets is just for the OS really and maybe some applications. But if you're going to store data, you probably want to look at either their Spaces, which is the object store, where you can get 250 gigabytes for as little as $5 a month, or their block storage, which gives you basically a volume you can put your own file system on and use however you want, which is great for ZFS storage or something in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
They also have snapshots. You can snapshot your machine in order to roll back to it or to clone it, and the snapshots cost only 5 cents per gigabyte per month. So you can keep a bunch of those around and always be able to undo things that change on your VM or whatever. And they offer full backups. If you have a backup of your VM, it costs only 20% of the original cost of the VM. So if you have the $5 droplet, the backup will only cost you $1 per month.
Yeah, this is you can go from small machines to big machines, and it's totally scalable. This is how the cloud works, after all. All right. In our next story, we have a Bitcoin full node on FreeBSD setup. With a bit of explanation what this whole Bitcoin thing is. This is over at bsdmag.org, so this is an article that is free. You don't have to subscribe to the magazine to read that. But it starts with basically what is Bitcoin, so that people who have been living under a rock or are new to this whole thing can get the idea what the cryptocurrency is. So it starts with that Bitcoin is a valuable, popular, open source cryptocurrency that was invented by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009. Bitcoins have value because they possess some characteristics like money, like durability, portability, fungibility, scarcity, divisibility, and recognizability, but based on the properties of mathematics rather than on physical properties like gold and silver, or trust in central authorities like flat currencies. In short, Bitcoin is backed by mathematics. Bitcoin is the first decentralized peer-to-peer cryptocurrency that is controlled by its users. Transactions take place directly between users, like between Alan and me, and are later verified by network nodes with digital signatures and then placed in public distributed ledgers called the blockchain. And Bitcoin is unique in that only 21 million Bitcoins will ever be created. So that's the artificial limit put into the system from the beginning. The unit of the Bitcoin system is Bitcoin, or M, capital B, capital T, capital C.
Which is millibitcoins, because if there's only 21 million Bitcoins and people are going to use them, you're probably not going to be using an entire Bitcoin. Anyway, they go on to describe what a Bitcoin wallet is. It's basically your private keys where you keep the currency that you're given, basically. And the blockchain is basically the bank statement for the whole network. And it talks a bit about how the mining works, which is basically computing a hash based on the previous hash, and keep doing that until you find a hash that starts with a significant number of zeros. And when you do, you've now found a Bitcoin, which the amount that you get, the reward goes up and down based on demand, but I think it's at 25 or 10. I think 25
it's
Bitcoins
more
right now.
Yeah, sometimes it's more and more, sometimes it's less, and so people have lost money and some people have gained money, and it's up and down.
Well, that's unrelated to the mining. That's just the traded value of them, but yes. So because it takes so much work to find one of these blocks of Bitcoin, generally you don't mine them individually, but you mine them as part of a pool. A bunch of people put the resources together, and then when somebody in the pool manages to come up with the hash that results in the significant number of leading zeros, then based on how much work was put in by each person, they split the resulting find. So a full node is a client that fully validates transactions and blocks. Basically, they keep the entire history of the Bitcoin network, and also help the network by accepting transactions and blocks from other full nodes, validating those transactions and blocks, and then relaying them to other full nodes. Originally, everybody was a full node, but it turns out downloading the history of every Bitcoin transaction since 2009 onto your cell phone in order to have the client on your cell phone didn't make any sense. But now so many people have these kind of light clients that they need more full clients. So this is a tutorial on how to set that up on a BSD.
This is pretty easy, actually, with the commands shown here.
Right, so basically it's a matter of installing the daemon, configuring it, and running the Bitcoin D and with the daemon mode. Currently, the database is about 150 gigabytes, and once it's up, you can actually go to this website and check for your node in the list of full nodes.
Yeah, in case your BSD machine is not doing much work, you can start mining Bitcoins to add.
Well, this isn't about mining. This is about basically being one of the people that keeps the ledger.
True. Yeah, it's just the daemon. Yeah, this is straightforward enough, so people can start those.
But next, we have some big news.
Yes, we do.
Two different things. The first is that the DRM Next Kmod, which is the port or package you install on FreeBSD head in order to get the latest graphics drivers, has been ported to work on FreeBSD 11 stable. What this means is that when FreeBSD 11.2 comes out shortly, which we'll get to the release schedule for that coming up in a few minutes, all all the latest graphics drivers will be available for that. You won't have to run head in order to have the latest graphics drivers on your new laptop.
Yeah, a lot of people have been waiting for that.
Mm-hmm. And a couple days after that announcement, they came up with the next one, which is the FreeBSD desktop team is happy to report, and thanks the tireless efforts of Johannes Lundberg and Hans-Peter Selesky, and they can report that the DRM Next KMod port has just received a big update, going from the equivalent of Linux 4.9 to 4.11. So this updates the KMS DRM drivers for AMD GPU, the Radeon, and the i915 systems. So that means your Haswell, Broadwell, Skylake CPUs, the built-in GPU, is now supported. So even your Skylake laptops have accelerated graphics on FreeBSD 11.2 when it comes out, or FreeBSD Head today. And the Evergreen, Kavari, Carrizo, and Polaris AMD GPUs are also supported now.
Very good.
Yes, needless to say, the possible space for hardware could run to significantly larger. If you find issues or want to propose patches, they provide a link to the GitHub repo where this work happens. But it's nice to see the graphics work accelerating and us getting to the point where even the releases of FreeBSD will have access to the latest graphics drivers as an external port, such that it can be updated. So even, once 11.2 comes out, normally new drivers would not happen for 11.2. You'd have to wait for 11.3. But because this is a port, it means that, when the 4.13 kernel or whatever with the newer graphics drivers is ported to FreeBSD, it'll just be a package update away, and you'll have it on your laptop.
Cool. That's certainly making a lot of people happy that are still missing the latest drivers.
Yes, I'm big thanks to the people that have been working on that.
Yep.
On both the
I know it's hard work.
Ports teams.
Yep. Integrating those and making them work with different, models and all this. It's certainly an effort. So thanks for that.
Thanks to all the users who helped with testing. It's not possible for the developers to have one of every one of these laptops to test it on. And the patience and willingness to help of the users has been a big important part of that.
Okay. But here's something that you require less graphics power for, which gives this episode its title, How Does CD Work? So this is a blog post here from Safia Abdallah, and writing that since the last blog post on the same blog he dove into one of the code behind the sudo command. I thought it was a pretty fun. Sudo is one of those commands that he's using quite often. But sorry. Yeah, I wasn't sure about the gender. Sorry. So this is a she here. Okay. So she hasn't had a chance to look into it truly. She started thinking about other commands that she uses on a daily basis, but had little understanding of the internals of. The first command that came to her mind is cd. So, CD, that stands for change directory. Simply put, it allows you to set your current working directory to a different working directory. So in case you've never done this before, pwd gives you your current working directory, and then you do cd somewhere else, and then you're in a different one. If you type pwd again, you're there.
CD is kind of special in that most commands, when the command exits, everything is back to how it was before the command ran, right? So if you just had a regular binary that did cd and it changed the directory, when it exit, you'd be back in the directory you were in originally. So cd is actually kind of special, and it turns out to be quite interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, continuing on. So the first thing she did was figure out what exactly was invoked when she ran the CD on the command line. She used the which command, which displays the path of the binary associated with a particular command. You probably use this as well. So we have a little example here in the code listed here. And oh bother, reading shell scripts can be such a hassle sometimes. She knows the tr command is used to translate characters. And in this particular case, the second half of the command, the part after the pipe symbol, basically converts the command cd dev to cd def in upper letters, capitals. She has no idea why this is. In any case, this modifies the command, or that modified command is passed to the built-in command, which is handled by the shell. In this case, the Born shell, as is the only one shell for shell programming, I might add, that we are using here. So
it's interesting. In my versions of FreeBSD, which have the same SVN modified date of 2005, the built-in command doesn't have the tr part in it, or doesn't echo in a subshell. It just does shell substitution. It's interesting.
Maybe the commit marker did.
Normally, when you're running your shell, certain commands are what are called built-in, and so the shell doesn't actually go and run user bin cd. And so when you're running sh, the Born shell, when you type cd, it's not actually going to run the shell script. It's going to handle it internally. But this script exists in case someone actually puts the path user bin cd, or is using some other shell or something that doesn't have it built in, and it will deal with it that way.
Okay.
That's why there's a shell script that it actually implements the cd command, and you can see it actually implements it by calling the built-in command with the subcommand and the arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, continue.
Okay. Yeah. So, where was it? Okay. Here, she decided to dive into the code for the Born shell to see what it might be able to figure out from those. And about these built-ins, she came across the definition of the CD built-in. Here, there's the link here in the blog post itself. Mm-hmm. And she'll admit that it was a hassle to read the file. For one, the source for bash does not have a mirror on GitHub, so she had to browse through a hosted version with a somewhat cumbersome file browser.
Well,
but all in all...
Should have read the source code for sh, not bash, but I imagine the built-in is relatively similar.
Yeah. So she read some of those, but it was in functions, and other bits were in templates, but after a while she figured that most of the code was a wrapper around a function called chdir, or changedir. A lot of the functions defined in the cd.def file linked above actually just invoke changedir and handle errors and parameter cleaning. Mm-hmm. So she did some Googling on what this changedir function is. It's a function that is a standard part of Unix. So to figure out how changedir worked, she had to dive into the code for the Linux kernel, which can be found at this location that most people probably know. And as she started, she usually does, by searching for the term changedir. Using the GitHub search bar, she found that it is accessible and useful. After scrolling through some of the results, she realized, oh my God, something she learned at university was going to come handy to her. So the changedir function implements a system call. What's a system call? A system call is a process by which a user program, like the bash, requests access from the kernel to execute a command. Usually this is done for commands that require a certain amount of privileges, like changing directory. And since this is a privileged command for the operating system perspective, you're essentially giving the user access to a new portion of the file system on the machine. So it makes sense that programs would have to pass that request to the kernel for security reasons, because there might be directories.
The kernel has to look at the permissions on the directory and see, are you allowed to go in there?
Yeah, you're allowed to go into cd/root, ROTT.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because otherwise you wouldn't have no meaning of the security, group, user, and world privileges.
Well, the file system security permissions have to be applied somewhere, and you don't want to trust the user program to do that. The kernel does it.
Yeah, and then we haven't even started about ACLs and such. So, but all in all, here is what happens when you run cd in the command line. First, the cd built-in is invoked as part of the bash shell. Second, the bash shell invokes the changedir function. Third, the change-dir function is part of Unix and invokes the change-dir system call.
Yeah,
and
so
fourth,
on Linux, that'll probably be glibc, and on BSD, that'll just be libc.
right, that's where the system calls reside.
Mm-hmm.
And the fourth command
is the functions that call the system.
Or the functions for it, yeah. See, the Unix kernel executes the change-dir call and does its own low-level thing. So she could dive into it a little bit more, how number 4 works, but let's be honest, she already read too much code at this point and her eyes are starting to hurt. That's okay. That's an interesting discovery about the CD function.
CD. I didn't know about the little shell script wrapper. That was interesting. But I would say that CD is actually one of the more complicated commands because it kind of violates one of the general principles that, when you run a command and get back to your shell should not have moved on you. But that's exactly what CD has to do. Otherwise, it's completely useless. And it makes it one of those kind of very interesting commands to understand the history of and how it's actually implemented.
Yeah, and simple commands like CD, they do a lot of stuff in the background which you don't necessarily see, but it's necessary to do these to make the system work as it works.
Yeah, because once you start thinking about CD, then you look at what happens when you CD through a symlink, and then when you do CD ... Do you go back to where you came from, or do you go one level up from where you are? And, what amount of tracking does it have to do if you want to be able to go back where you came from, not one level up from where you ended up?
Yeah.
Then it becomes
CD backslash wherever.
Yeah. Like if you CD into a symlink that's actually a pointer to something 4 levels deeper, and you go ... go up one level, you'll
where am I now?
3 levels deep instead of going back to the beginning like you thought. And you understand, well, we can't keep track of where the path everyone's taken to get in everywhere in order to go back like that. And so it's actually quite an interesting bit of the system. And especially when you think that things like CD are actually relatively universal even across other operating systems, right? Even DOS had CD, and it's not that much of DOS is really that based on Unix. And yet they have very similar things to have to deal with.
Characteristics. Yeah, and it makes people easier when they're switching because then they know a couple of commands at least. So now it's time to go into the BSD bits this week, starting with the second meeting of the Stockholm BSD user group on March 22nd.
Yes. So you definitely want to, if you're in Stockholm, you definitely want to go check that out. It's from 5:30 to 9 p.m. At the cafeteria of the B3IT company. Yeah.
So that's Kungsbron 2 in Stockholm. And if you've been there before or are a new BSD user in the Stockholm area, then we encourage you to go because you are getting a couple of BSD faces and talk interesting things about the BSDs in general. Or if you're a new user, you can learn about what the BSDs are and all these things. Or if you're a little bit more experienced, then find like-minded people.
Yep. They're also looking for people to give short and long presentations. So if you have even just a very short work in progress or something, just an idea you want to talk about, they're looking for that. And while they mostly do English, they're happy to have it in Swedish as well if you struggle with one language or the other. So just come out, hang out, talk to people, share your ideas. It's the whole point of BSD.
Exactly, yeah. And the more people you have in your city or the surrounding cities, you might as well think, hey, why don't we do this regularly? Mm-hmm. Another thing that we've found is the Open Source Hardware Camp 2018. There's a call for participation. So this is over at the UK FreeBSD mailing list, I guess.
Yeah. So our friend Savan Janian puts out this notice here and saying this year's Open Source Hardware Camp will take place on Saturday, June 30th and the Sunday, July 1st at the Blue Room in Lincoln in the UK. We're excited to be hosting the Open Source Hardware Camp for the first time ever in the historic county town of Lincoln, home to, among other noted engine builders, Ruston and Hornsby, which is now owned by Siemens and a bunch of other stuff. But there's no theme or topics, but things that people are interested in that'll be there include open source hardware projects, open development practices and principles, novel, interesting, or fun projects built using open source hardware, tools, both hardware and software, skills and techniques like PCB fabrication or do-it-yourself SMT assembly, relevant technologies like SPI or I2C, bus programming and something or anything else that will be relevant to the community. If you'd like to give a talk on the Saturday or run a workshop on the Sunday, please submit the details to the form they have here. If you have any questions, you should email andrew@abopen.com. The deadlines for submissions will be Monday, March 25th at 5 p.m. So if you want to talk about your idea and get some feedback before you submit it, you want to get on top of that sooner.
Yeah, by all means, submit something and give a talk. Do they say something about recordings or some other ways of getting into for those people who couldn't make it? Well, maybe we'll get something after the conference is over.
Yes. So, as promised earlier, we will talk a bit about the 11.2 release schedule for FreeBSD.
Oh, yes.
So it's a reminder will be sent to everyone on March 16th. So basically, once everybody's home and caught up on sleep from AsiaBSDCon, we'll send out the reminder reminding people that basically a month from then, the tree will be frozen on April 20th. And any more changes to FreeBSD 11 will require explicit approval from the release engineering team. The idea is to keep the number of changes at that point small so that all the testing that goes on isn't invalidated by changes, and any bugs that are found in the betas can be fixed. And then they will start building the betas in early May, and those will come out, and we will get people to test them. And then the branch will be made. So basically, stable 11 will be copied into Rattling 11.2. And once that happens and they cut the first release at the beginning of June, stable 11 will be thawed and allowed to continue and eventually go on to become what is 11.3. And then some other release candidates will be cut, and then the final release is expected before the end of June.
Oh, great. Right after BSDCan, basically, when we, are assured that it's releasable and there are no late changes or things that break. This looks like a decent schedule.
Yes. In particular, I think it looks like BSDCan will allow people to basically beat up on the release candidate. I can just picture the hacker room where everybody tries 11.1 on their machine.
Find the last bug.
And tries to find any bugs and beat on it some more and make sure everything works.
Yep, having a conference close by is good to flesh out some of the details if there are still some pending or open ends.
Yes, or the other thing is any bugs that are still being looked at, getting a bunch of people in a room to solve it usually results in it getting solved a lot faster.
Yep. Very nice. So next up is something I've been looking forward to when it's coming out. Serious Shell Programming by Devin Teskey. So she is embarking on a book writing on gitbook.com. So this is about serious shell programming, as mentioned. So there's a little description here. All currently maintained Unix Linux operating systems have a POSIX-compliant bin.sh. If you want to write shell scripts that run on any Unix Linux system, this is the book for you. So this book will push the boundaries of your knowledge of Unix Linux scripting by introducing techniques to overcome the most daunting tasks. Issues once thought to be too complex for shell programming are tackled in depth and in a cross-platform compatible nature. While there are many shells in Unix Linux world, this book focuses on POSIX-compliant Bourne shell for the best portability. POSIX shell is well supported on, to name a few, FreeBSD, NetBSD, Solaris, and Linux included Red Hat, CentOS, Ubuntu, and a great many more. Techniques specific to other shells, such as Bourne Again shell or the bash, are avoided, allowing you to write code targeting more platforms with fewer dependencies. Yes, and other programming languages may offer more built-in features, but POSIX shell provides everything required. Things like substrings, arrays, structs, floating point arithmetic, and much more will be presented in the following chapters.
I've seen Devin do structs in shell, and I didn't think that was a thing. And watching that happen was like, oh, I have a whole new respect for what you can do with shell script nowadays.
It's very powerful, yeah.
Yep.
I will take a more deeper dive into it.
Some of the basic chapters here, just covering the difference between single-quoted, double-quoted, and unquoted strings, or doing compound strings, or here docs versus indented here docs, and literal here docs, and in-memory here docs, and how to do conditionals, like when you do if, basically, and the built-in test program and how that works with the square bracket operator. Control flows, like your if, else, case statements, for loops, while loops, etc. All kinds of interesting things.
Yep. So if you click on the little red read button, no, it's not red, it's green, sorry. Mm-hmm. You can find a couple of chapters. It's not finished yet as far as I can see.
No.
But there's some stuff in there already.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of in here, and obviously lots more to go.
Okay, I guess once it's out, then we should do an interview with Devin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll make a note. All right, moving on to another book writer of BSD fame, SSH Mastery, second edition is now out. So that's very nice because I've been involved a little bit by sponsoring that one, at least the print edition. So it's short and sweet by Michael W. Lucas, of course. For the last week or so, the new edition of SSH Mastery has been leaking out. It's now available in print via Amazon and in ebooks just about everywhere. iTunes, Kobo, his bookstore, on his website, and more. The print version will soon be available through Ingram's distribution as well, including a dust-jacketed hardcover version. Ooh,
yes,
that's going to be a couple more. Yeah, I look forward to seeing one in hand. I guess there will be an auction item for BSD Can.
What's interesting is I saw this commit go by and noted it for two different reasons. The first is FreeBSD's source repository has passed commit number 330,000.
Oh, nice.
We're fast approaching 333,333. But 330,001 is an implementation of the client side of TCP Fast Open by Patrick Kelsey, who did the server side of it a number of years ago for VeriSign for DNS servers, but it lacked the client side. And it seems Limelight Networks has sponsored him to finish the client side. So what this is for is normally when you open a connection with a remote host, you have a three-way handshake. And if that host is far away, like say one's in North America and one's in Japan, it can take 250 milliseconds for a packet to go there and back. And so opening a connection takes longer, but it's required for security. However, right, the three-way handshake is what prevents IP spoofing in TCP. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking to a host you've talked to many times before, TCP Fast Open is an optimization where basically when you make the first expensive connection, you basically get a cookie that you can use later when you show up a second time, being, oh, I've been here before, right? It's kind of like when you're going into a concert or whatever, when you get the wristband that proves that you've already paid and got in or whatever.
And when does this expire?
I forget. The server controls how long cookies are good for,
active,
or how quickly they rotate the keys or whatever. Mm-hmm. But this allows you to reopen a connection to a host you've talked to before much more quickly. So if you frequently opening and closing connections between some hosts, this can make a big difference. The reason VeriSign wanted it was for doing DNS queries over TCP. But it can be a big boon for CDNs and stuff as well.
Sure. I can imagine a lot of people...
Anything you're doing over a high latency connection where you're making constant connections to the same thing. Even just my phone to my mail server or something could make a big difference.
Yeah. And what's not to like about that? Mm-hmm. Certainly people will make use of that. Maybe for our next item, it might also be helpful. This is an open letter from the Tor BSD diversity project to help increase the Tor BSD project OS diversity of Tor nodes for your own safety and everyone else's. So, I guess we covered this before a little bit.
Yeah, but this is now the 3-year anniversary of the Tor BSD diversity project. or TDP, which is working to bring BSDs into the mainstream for the privacy-enhancing technologies ecosystem. Their aim is to expand the use of BSDs as a platform for Tor relays, Tor public nodes, and in the Tor anonymity network in general. Tor is a critical tool for maintaining privacy online, frequently employed by journalists, human rights workers, and those residing in repressive or censored environments. Many people in the BSD community know about the Tor Diversity Project, whether from BSD conferences or our development work, such as porting the Tor browser to OpenBSD. We are committed to extending the presence of all the BSDs into the privacy-enhancing technologies ecosystem. Yet beyond our immediate circles, we believe untapped resources in the BSD community need to be enlisted. A large number of major firms employing BSD code and systems in their businesses, from enterprise-grade backup firms to ISPs. BSDs are very popular in that thing. So the Tor Diversity Project is requesting that firms which rely on the BSDs and related open source technologies consider running a Tor relay or bridge in their name. So one of the sponsors of the project is the New York Internet, which is a data center firm that uses FreeBSD and hosts the East Coast FreeBSD mirror and cluster. And they've committed to running 2 high bandwidth relays maintained by their staff with help from the Tor Diversity Project.
Oh, excellent. Good news.
But the main complaint is that the majority of Tor relays run Linux, and having a majority of your privacy technology relying on one underlying technology is bad. So more diversity is better.
Yeah, in case there's an exploit that only targets Linux, then all these Tor nodes are affected. And if there's more diversity in operating systems running Tor, then there's a bit better chance that BSDs are unaffected, or vice versa. So monocultures are generally not good in this case. So having a little bit more different operating systems available in the Tor relay network is good to have.
They say beyond running a relay to support the Tor network in general, there's also the possibility of making your own services available over the Tor network via a .onion address. Firms such as Facebook illustrate the advantage of explicitly offering an onion address for their site, as it provides users additional security and privacy guarantees above and beyond those on the public internet. Integrating Tor into your internet presence may be more work than running just a Tor node, but it also gives more weight to the idea that privacy is a feature that users need, desired, and can reasonably expect. So, if your entity isn't ready to run a Tor node, but you're interested in donating resources such as bandwidth, hardware, or monetary support, please contact the Tor Diversity Project.
Yep. And our last item is 5 differences between TrueOS and Linux. So this is over at compulsa.com. And just basically listing, we just list the reasons, not the whole article, but it's well worth reading. Reason 1, TrueOS and FreeBSD descended from Research Unix. So this is
they're real Unix, not just a cheap knockoff.
Yep. Reason 2, OpenRC, not systemd. So that's an important differentiator for many people who don't like systemd that much. So OpenRC is there to alleviate that a little bit. Reason 3 is security. So that's listing those security features that are available in TrueOS.
TrueOS incorporates a Tor mode, which is kind of similar to the Tor browser bundle used in Kali Linux, but it takes it a step further, but automatically routing your traffic through Tor in a matter of seconds with a single click. After implementing Tor mode, your traffic is rerouted at a system level, meaning you can use whatever web browser you like.
Oh, see?
Plus,
Reason 4.
The concept of stealth user sessions, where you can log in on the system, but have every change to the disk made after you log out is undone.
Yeah, things like that to be secure once the disk leaves the drive slot. All right. Reason 4 is licensing. We can't mention this enough, but it's the differentiator for many people because the BSD license follows a truly open model while still protecting the author of the software from any liability. And there's more, of course. Reason 5 is familiarity. Because
there isn't as much that's different than there is in common between TrueOS and a Linux. When using TrueOS, you'll be comfortable using the terminal or the GUI because they're the same GNOME or KDE or LXDE or whatever that you've been using on Linux. Not to mention, since Linux is mostly POSIX compliant and BSD is even more compliant, command line utilities work the same as you expect on your Linux distribution. Taking things one step further, you can customize your BSD licensed desktop using Lumina and get all kinds of fun. Plus, TrueOS has access to the FreeBSD ports tree, which provides you with 30,000 precompiled packages or building them from source yourself.
Yep, that should get you around town for a while, trying out all of these. But yeah, figure out whether TrueOS is something for you and give it a shot. What you also should do before we go into our feedback and questions section, thinking about backups. And the sponsor for the next section in this episode is Tarsnap, of course, because they provide the online backups for the truly paranoid. So you've been thinking, well, I should probably do more backups and regularly, but, well, I don't have the disk space available, but there's this whole cloud thing where there's terabytes, multi-terabytes of disk space I could use, but I want to have my stuff encrypted in the cloud. But that's certainly not easy unless you use Tarsnap.
There are plenty of companies who will sell you encrypted storage in the cloud, but they won't give you the source code for the client so that you can make sure the encryption is happening on your machine and that the key material is never leaving your machine.
It's a trust issue, definitely.
Every other provider says, hey, trust us. We know what we're doing. We're selling you mil-spec encryption, whatever. Tarsnap is, here's the source code, see for yourself.
Yeah, they trust that you can understand this. And if you don't want to look at the source code too much, just want to use the service, it's quite easy. It generates basically a local key that is the opening key for your encrypted backup, because only the encrypted backup is going into the cloud, and your key never hopefully leaves your computer. And as long as you have the key, then you can decrypt it.
You probably want to print a hard copy of the key and keep it in a safe place, because when you're going to want your backups is when something happens to your machine. And if the only copy of your key was on the machine when something bad happened to it, then you have no copies of the key, and then your data is encrypted and you can never decrypt it.
Yeah, not even the Tarsnap folks
feature.
Can get to
that. The idea
Yeah.
is, if your data is out in the cloud and you decide that you don't want anyone to be able to have access to it, then all you have to do is destroy the key, and it's all useless. You've just slagged all the data and turned it into a paperweight. Then you can just make a new key and do fresh backups, and only those backups will be useful.
Yeah. Maybe you do a yearly backup refresh and create a new key, and then that way you know that no one else could get to your backup stored in the cloud. Because the cloud might be, we're copying stuff here and there, no one knows about how this works. But as long as you have it securely encrypted, then no one can get to it. And the contents
If we've learned anything from services like Dropbox, just because you deleted your file and they say they deleted your file doesn't mean that your file's deleted.
Yeah.
Don't trust anybody. Be sure. Use Tarsnap.
Yeah. Be paranoid about this a little bit more than other things, and then you can rest easy that you're the only person getting to your backups. All right. Going into our feedback and questions section, these are a little bit more elaborate, so we picked those because they are longer than the ones we usually get. So we picked only 2 this week, but we take some time to answer those. So the first one is Ambrose with a bunch of questions. Let me start reading here. So he writes, I have TrueOS on his he has TrueOS on his laptop, and he's learning TrueOS and FreeBSD this way. He gathers that TrueOS is based on FreeBSD and has some extra packages over FreeBSD and maybe some slightly different configuration of some items. So he has a fair amount of experience from Linux, and he can use the command line. He's trying now to learn FreeBSD, and it's not going that well. So he has found that handbooks in the local user local share doc, FreeBSD repository, which is somewhat helpful, but they don't always answer the questions that he has, which are more like, I know Postgres has config files that specify where the data files are. Where is that config file? So the question specifically here is, all those ports and the package system. So he understands that on FreeBSD, the software is split into two tiers, the base system and the ports. Okay, so ports can be installed with PortSnap or CVS or Make. He understands that if the software is installed by a package, it would also not be installed with ports. So the zeroth question...
Let me answer one of the questions.
Sure.
So yes, on FreeBSD, software is split into the base system, which is already installed on your system, and ports, which are third-party programs that you might want. They're optional software, basically. The ports tree itself is just the infrastructure for getting them. So you can use PortSnap or SVN, not CVS, to get a copy of the ports tree, but that's just basically the recipe book for those applications. You can install them via ports, but you probably want to use package. It's easier and faster. So you, just like on Linux where you would, apt-get install foo or yum install foo, you just pkg install foo and it will install foo. If you want to do the port version, then after you run PortSnap or whatever to get the ports tree, you go into user ports and then whatever category and then foo and type make install. The handbook might be more useful looking at the online version if you go to freebsd.org/handbook, although the version installed on your system will work if you point your browser at it. There's a whole chapter on how to use the ports tree, and it'll probably make more sense. For Postgres, specific information about configuring Postgres, you're best off going to the Postgres website. How to start a service is covered in the handbook, but it's generally similar to what you would do on Linux, service foo start, and it will start the service. The service does have to be enabled, so you might want to look at sysrc for that as well.
Right. But the config files are in a different location on Linux than on FreeBSD. They're not in etc.
Well, that depends a bit. Some config files go somewhere else too. It's really up to the program. But
yeah.
Yes.
But there's a distinction between user local etc and /etc.
Most config files for ports will be under user local etc instead of /etc.
Yeah, because they're separate from the base system. They're not part of the system itself, while Linux pushes everything into etc, and you don't know, this is an operating system config file, or did this come from a software package I was installing? Okay, so the zeroth question he's having. Can you install some packages with ports and some with package? Yes, you can.
So previously, we recommended against this because the packages that were available, so think FreeBSD 8, the packages that were available were compiled once when the release came out. So when FreeBSD 8.2 came out, they compiled the set of packages and that was it. So mixing that with ports, which might be months and months or years newer, could cause endless problems. Nowadays, where package is recompiled every couple of days, you're much less likely to run into problems. So you can probably mostly use package and then use ports for the couple of things you might need. Then yes, that will work.
Yeah. In general, for all these questions, it would also help to buy a book, maybe the new FreeBSD, Absolute FreeBSD by Michael W. Lucas.
But that's not out yet. Won't be out till...
Yeah, sure. But
June.
It will contain a couple of good information. So his now first question, if he builds and installs with ports and make no changes to the configuration in any package, then is it okay to mix ports and package commands on the same software, like install with package and uninstall with ports?
Yes, they both use the same package database. In general, if you don't need to customize it, you might as well just use package for everything.
Save some time this way. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, second question. He installed several Postgres packages using package. Then he did a PortSnap update fetch and then a make extract. The goal was to examine the source code and not build or install it. Although he might build, but is not going to install from ports at this stage, is it okay to mix PortSnap and make commands like that as long as he tries not to install from ports when he has already installed with package?
Yes. So if you do make extract in, user ports, databases, Postgres 9.6 or whatever, it'll make the work directory and extract the tarball, and you can look at the source for Postgres. That's fine.
Yep. Okay, third question. So he was in the directory user ports, databases, Postgres 9.4-server when he gave the PortSnap update fetch command. When it finished, his current working directory was invalid. Did I do something wrong? No, you didn't. Well, let me answer it.
Go ahead.
This is updating your local ports tree, and apparently Postgres 9.4 got replaced by 9.5 or 9.6, and that removed Postgres 9.4 because it's not supported anymore. That's how the directory
or
disappeared.
in some cases, it just deletes the directory and makes the new one and so on. And so, yes, if you just cd to it again, if it's there, then that works. If not, yes. The old versions of Postgres get retired eventually when they're replaced by newer versions. I think we normally have about 3 or 4 different supported versions of Postgres at any one time. And so when we add a 5th one, we usually delete the oldest one to avoid having too much work to do.
Okay, up next is the fourth question. To make this current working directory valid again, he issued cd user ports databases Postgres 9.4 server. Then he ran make extract. The purpose of getting the Postgres source was to find out how Postgres figures out where the data directory is, because the config files of Postgres that you can find don't seem to say. In user local, Postgres is a bit special in this regard. In user local pgsql/data xxx.conf, all the time items which might indicate where the database data files are commented out. He guesses the default is hard-coded in the Postgres make files, which had been customized for FreeBSD builds.
It won't be in the make files probably, but so don't try to read the auto-make generated make files. Save yourself some brain cells.
But you still in Postgres have to do the initdb, where you can define where your database cluster is going to be issued, and it can be
down to it's actually an rc.conf setting to control where it goes, right?
Yeah, I think there's a Postgres
use initdb to create it, but then you have to tell the service where it is for it to find it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a little bit special in Postgres.
Yeah. So you probably want to read user local etc rc.d/postgres whatever, and you'll see the defaults defined there in the shell script.
Yep. Okay, his 5th question is, working with source code in ports or in the base system as root. As far as he can tell, you have to be root to work with the source code, to build, even to extract. Is that right?
Nope. You can compile, you can extract and compile as not root. It will depend on where you're trying to do it. You have to have permissions to the directory where you're about to create or extract or whatever.
Yeah. Otherwise, normal users can do a lot of things, but for root privileges, you can also work with sudo, but working all the time with
root, permissions on the ports tree are correct, you can do everything, and then when you try to make install, it'll prompt you for the root password to su to root and do the install part. So yes, it's completely possible to compile or to extract and compile all the ports as a non-root user.
Yeah. In this regard, this is not too difficult. Yeah. It's not too different from Linux in this way. I guess the rest of this question is pretty much covered.
Yeah, so I'd say for that, basically do it all as a non-root user, and the ports framework will automatically prompt you when it needs root privileges for specific things.
Okay, next is the 6th question he has. I think package wants to use PGSQL as the Postgres user and ports defaults to Postgres. Is that right?
No. Package and ports will use the same thing. You might be seeing a difference caused by a different version, but I don't think so.
Yeah, they recently renamed that user, I think, from the change to 9.6 or to 9.5. It's in user ports updating. There's an entry there.
By default, the package might be using the quarterly branch, the stable branch of packages, which is only updated once every 3 months. And ports, by default, will be the head branch, which is updated every day. And so what you're seeing there is a difference because you're getting 2 different versions. Yeah,
that's the change that happens in the ports because the maintainer thought it would be better to name it that way.
And in ports or in package, there's an updating file that warns you about things like that.
Yep. Okay. Number 7 is on TrueOS overlays on FreeBSD and how it interacts with this package systems. So there's also this GUI thing, sysadm. Is it okay to install packages with package in sysadm, or should he avoid that and only use sysadm when using TrueOS?
TrueOS mostly tries to stop you using the manual package, and you should use the sysadm tools. They rely on knowing what you're doing, and So you shouldn't try to mix them probably.
Yeah, it's he asks if sysadm a layer over the package system, or is he misunderstanding how sysadm works?
Yeah, so generally sysadm is going to call the package system for you, and it does some extra stuff. And as far as I know, sysadm does not use the port system. No, in general, there's not many times when you need to use the port system.
It seems like you're really trying to get the Postgres server started, and you come up with all kinds of things that are special in FreeBSD with Postgres port, because it's pretty much covered in all these questions. Google FreeBSD Postgres. We did this a while ago, where we did a Postgres installation on ZFS for Postgres, and there are a couple of pointers there that might help you get started with Postgres on FreeBSD. Yeah, that's so about the service starting.
7A, they ask about, they enabled Postgres in sysadm and noticed no changes in rc.conf. You might look in etc rc.conf.d/Postgres and see what's different. The name of the service might be Postgres-server or something, I'm not sure.
All right. Is there an 8th question? I was just looking for... so he basically mentions he's just getting started. He wants to really get his hands dirty with FreeBSD. That's good. Don't give up that easily. He has various things he's been doing on Linux that he wants to try to do on FreeBSD. That's totally normal. And to make it harder, he's also going to try to change from Apache to light TTPD. Supposedly, it should make his life easier, but we'll see. Those are next steps after I got Postgres to run. Yeah, that reminds me of my first web server. I wanted to do Lighty, and then I discovered Nginx and then never looked back. But yeah. He's asking about the podcast itself. So first off, thanks for the podcast. First thing is, there are a few segments on the podcast: the news, BSD bits, community questions, interviews, and the roundup. What other segments are there, and what are the goals of each segment? Well, we basically have this distinction between longer stories and smaller stories.
Well, there's a little bit less of a distinction now, honestly. But yes, the original idea was the news was 3 or 4 of the big stories where we kind of go into detail. Then we'd have the interview. Then we'd have the roundup, which was slightly quicker version, meant to be a little bit faster and just kind of point you to stuff and let you dig into it more if you wanted. On my previous podcast, where the idea of the roundup came from, the roundup was actually what the BSD bits were, but originally we didn't have BSD bits. We added them after, when the roundup became too long. So the roundup is meant to be like the news, but for stuff that maybe doesn't apply to everyone. And if you're interested, you can go off and read more about it rather than us providing the full details to you. Yeah. The BSD bits is rapid fire, just a set of links. If you notice in the show notes, we don't summarize the story or anything. It's just, here's a bunch of links that you might want to look at. Yeah, that's a good starting point, or an overview of how the show is structured. So he closes with, he has asked a couple of questions on IRC. He got replies with, that's TrueOS, go ask them, or read the handbooks. So he asks, basically, he's trying a lot of stuff himself. That's good. But sometimes he needs a little bit of a helping hand. So he asks whether we know a help channel or something that could help him get over the first hurdles. Isn't there a FreeBSD help channel? It's slightly complicated in that certain things that are FreeBSD specific, certain things apply to both FreeBSD and TrueOS. And so the FreeBSD handbook is a good guide to everything. But TrueOS changes a bunch of things, and obviously the FreeBSD handbook is not going to cover how TrueOS does it differently. And, if your question is about sysadm or the interaction between sysadm and ports, somebody who's not a TrueOS user isn't going to know how to answer that question for you. The TrueOS people have a number of forums and help things, and they're usually pretty active. I would probably say that's the best place to look. They don't use IRC in mailing lists so much. They have forums, and they have some online chat things and a Telegram channel or something.
Yeah, that's a good starting point. Yeah, definitely send us follow-up questions you might have. Don't give up. And I hope you, once you've been through the handbook once or twice at least, you, I think, can make the connections between the dots better and get something working.
Yeah, although I think if we don't already, we should have a decent chapter in the handbook about Postgres, because there's a bunch of things that aren't going to be in the Postgres documentation, like controlling where the data directory is and doing the initialization of the database.
Yeah.
And just the things like enabling the service and setting the directory and the initialization setup, the bits that are kind of specific to FreeBSD. Where they're going to be.
Could be an article for itself.
I think it makes more sense to put it in a handbook because it makes it more discoverable than elsewhere.
Well, something for the to-do list.
I don't know. Well, maybe while we're in Tokyo, you write the Postgres one, and I'll write the MySQL and MariaDB one, and we'll.
Oh, okay.
Throw it out.
Okay, yeah, we'll try to be busy there, one way or the other.
Well, one of the early days when we're trying to pass time in the afternoon. I don't know, like Monday or Tuesday or something.
Before we have our core meeting.
Monday night, we have hours of time after dinner that we need to burn up while we wait for the core call, right? So.
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay, we'll be spending the time well. Okay, that's this part of the question, but there's another one, another big one from Eddie with ZFS on Linux with single SSDs. So, of course, we know, he writes, he knows that ZFS on Linux is out of scope of BSD Now. Well, we mentioned it a couple of times, but he was hoping to get some help from Alan on the subject since he has some experience. I too, but yeah, okay. So he added a 500 gigabyte Samsung 850 EVO SSD in his Linux laptop with the intent to configure ZFS on it so he can have two datasets. A Fedora dataset for various non-sensitive data and a backup dataset for backup purposes. He doesn't consider root on ZFS since he's not aware that support is not that mature on Linux. No, it is not. Much less in the Ubuntu 16.4 LTS version of ZFS on Linux. And don't get us started on boot environments. That's not going to go there. Okay. So he already created a data set, and his Z pool has only the SSD partition, like no block duplication configured, no redundancy. There's a listing at the bottom here for people who are interested in that. He's aware that the SSDs perform better if they are not filled to the maximum, so that he typically does with SSDs to partition them to about 85% of their capacity. He did the same for the ZFS pool as the ZSSD in his case, and added just that partition to the SSD pool and nothing else. Since this pool is in the Fedora laptop, but he has one more SATA slot and one micro SATA slot available for the future expansion, he intends to have only SSDs as physical devices forming the Z pool. He did some tuning according to what he understood here and there, but he suspects they are not optimal. So his questions are, question 0. As one does questions in computer science, we always start with 0. Okay, first question is, what should he be careful about in the ZFS on Linux implementation? Is there something significant missing that he should be aware of?
No, I'm not sure about the version that ships with older OSs and so on, but the latest release of ZFS on Linux is definitely pretty stable. If you have problems, they're very unlikely to result in data loss. There's, in the end, ZFS is ZFS.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that. It should work. It's been stable, and people have been using it. So it's not something that just came out last week. Then he continues with his next question. I saw all guides recommend giving ZFS raw devices, but is there another way to ensure a maximum of, say, 85% usage on the actual SSDs that using partitions?
So I'm not sure if this is what the device meant or a device that you got was about, but it mostly means not going through a RAID controller, making like a virtual mirror and then passing that to ZFS. On FreeBSD, it's a lot of times you use partitions rather than devices. But on ZFS, yes, you can set what's called a reservation, which says, this data set is guaranteed this much free space. So on every one of my systems, there's an extra data set called pool/reserved, and it's X terabytes, and that space never gets used by anybody. and it ensures that that space remains free. I do this partly to cause my load disk space alarm to go off early, and when it does, I'm like, okay, I acknowledge that, lower the reservation a little bit, freeing up some space for me to do stuff while I solve the problem, like, say, go and buy 32 more hard drives.
Yeah, as one does.
But in general, using a partition isn't necessarily bad. It can impact on a more storage appliance-like thing, where you're going to want like hot spares and automatic replacement. It's a bit more complicated. There's some more advantages to having the whole disk be ZFS rather than just a partition, as far as the automatic replacement stuff, without requiring administrative input. But on your laptop, partitions are perfectly fine, and it's not going to cause any problems.
Okay. So he next asks, how can he tune the Z SSD pool to better match the storage on SSDs to not kill it prematurely, like trim support and stuff?
Not much you have to do. It's already going to do fine. There is no trim support for ZFS on Linux yet. There's a patch coming from Nexenta that will go into ZFS on Linux. I don't know how far along that is at the moment. As far as I'm aware, the work is finished. It just needs to be integrated.
Yeah, that's one differentiator between the ZFS on Linux and the ZFS on FreeBSD.
The new one coming from Nexenta is better, though. It's more tightly integrated with ZFS. And so once it's available, FreeBSD will be using that one as well. But at this time, FreeBSD is the only operating system that has trim for ZFS.
Yep. Okay, 2.1. How do I better tune the dataset and Z-pool to know when I know the typical access for his dataset is very, or his dataset actually, is very seldom additions of new data and seldom reads, almost no removes?
There's no tuning. ZFS doesn't need any tuning for that.
And 2.2 is the same basically for his backup dataset to ensure redundancy. Well, that's different. Except in case of SSD general failure. Does it make sense, or are SSDs known to fail entirely all of a sudden, so he just killed the storage with duplication on the same physical device? So redundancy can be done in two levels, on the pool side and on like copies equals 2 or something.
Right. In general, SSDs are more likely to just completely give up or fault into being read-only. Very rarely, like, you're going to see a single sector failure or something. And so, setting copies equals 2 is probably just going to waste the space on your SSD. And technically more likely to burn it up sooner since you're writing blocks twice as much.
Multiple times, so 2.3 is, that's pretty much what we covered already about trim support. Pretty experimental still. Does it make sense to try to install a new backported version? Well, currently it's not there yet, but it's coming, as Alan mentioned, so just wait for the next Nexenta edition. So don't worry too much that your SSDs will die too soon. That's not going to happen all too soon.
Most SSDs don't really require trim, and some of them it actually makes the drive slower. It does a bunch of work when it doesn't need to.
Yeah, but
mostly the advantage of trim is obviated by you leaving that 15+% of free space. Because that space is always free, it always can work around it. It doesn't need the trim so much. And if you're rarely removing data, you're not going to be issuing very many trims anyway.
Sure. So his third question is, in the case he adds more SSDs to his laptop, how should adding that to the Z-pool work to get redundancy?
So if you use, instead of Z-pool add, to add an extra VDEV, use Z-pool attach. And you can attach the second SSD to the first SSD, and it'll automatically upgrade it to a mirror. It's one of the only cases where you can change the type of a VDEV, is turning a single VDEV into, or a non-redundant VDEV into a mirror, or the other way around. Yeah.
So you don't need the mirror keyword, but if you're starting from scratch with two SSDs, both empty.
It would be zpool attach, pool name, existing disk, new disk, or partition of the disk, and it will just attach it, and it'll upgrade it to a mirror, copy the files over, and you're good to go. No other manual intervention required. So you don't have to manually migrate anything. For RAID Z, switching to RAID Z, though, you'd have to create a new pool and copy the data over.
That's not being impossible to create from an existing disk. That goes into
if you end up with 3 SSDs, RAID Z1 might be better. You get the storage of 2 of the 3 SSDs instead of 1. But if you're really worried about failures, then a 3D mirror is better. But with SSDs, maybe you're not that worried about the failure.
Yeah, that goes into a sub-question here that RAID Z1 to 3 are not that flexible as RAID 10. VDEVs, is this true?
Yes. So, if you build a RAID Z1, now obviously in your laptop, this is both more and less true. If you're building a NAS and you build a RAID Z1 of 3 disks, or say 4 disks with a RAID Z1, if you want to add more storage, you'd want to add 4 more disks, which is complicated, right? That's buying 4 more disks and making sure you have enough slots for it and so on. Whereas
for RAID
if
10,
you do mirrors, if you do the RAID 10, you just add 2 disks at a time. It also means if you're upgrading in place, right? You have an existing NAS that has 6 hard drives. If they're RAID Z2, and you want to replace all the 1 terabyte drives with 4 terabyte drives, you'd have to upgrade all 6 before you get the extra storage. If it was 3 sets of mirrors, right? 3 mirror sets. As soon as you upgraded 2 of the disks in the same mirror set, you would get that bit of extra space. And then you can upgrade the next one. And the next one, you grow the space more quickly that way. And with fewer hard drives. And mirrors, you can add and remove disks from a mirror without any problems. RAID Z, you can't add or remove disks from a RAID Z. You will be able to add disks next year when work sponsored by Delphix and the FreeBSD Foundation is finished to allow you to add an additional disk to an existing RAID Z 1, 2, or 3. But that's a year away still.
Yeah, well, I hear that the project is progressing nicely, and we're going to see something sooner rather than later materialize. But yeah,
I know
it's generally...
I need to check the schedule and see if Matt didn't mention if he ended up submitting for BSDCan or not.
I wish the schedule was here already, but there is certainly going to be some kind of announcement at this conference.
I know that he specifically mentioned at the ZFS Developer Summit about presenting work in progress at BSDCan and hopefully a finished product by the Developer Summit next October.
Oh yeah, certainly. That would be good to hear. Okay,
so last question.
Yeah, number 4 is he's thinking of building or buying a low-cost home server running FreeNAS to allow his replication of the data sets that we mentioned above and some other data sets with family pictures, albums, things he doesn't want to lose. Performance shouldn't be a huge concern, so he's considering HDDs in the Z pool. Mm-hmm. Since he's in Romania and buying from IX Systems would be risky and maybe not possible at all. Do you recommend he starts from regular consumer server offer for something like Dell or HP, or should he focus on the recommendation of the FreeNAS community, even if that means buying some SH motherboard, ECC RAM and processor, but new HDDs?
That's really up to you. The focus would be on the hard drives, I suppose.
Yep. You can start with a relatively cheap or simple system as long as it has the drive slots. And
yes. The big thing is having enough SATA ports or buying a controller card like the LSI 9207 8i or whatever. And then building an NAS out of it. Yes, the FreeNAS forum has lots of advice on that. Some of it better than others, but in general, if you have a system, you can basically build ZFS on top of anything. But good hard drives are really important, and some good ECC RAM.
And if you do something wrong, or like you can't do much wrong, it's just in case some newer system is being built where you want to migrate, you can zpool export and zpool import, or you can do ZFS send to the new system. This is all possible.
The biggest thing to consider when you're building the new system is our comments about the flexibility of RAID, of RAID Z. While it, in the end, costs more money for the same amount of storage to do sets of mirrors, it means you can upgrade the system by adding 2 disks at a time, and upgrade the system by swapping out 2 old disks for 2 newer disks. Whereas if you do it with RAID Z, maybe you do sets of 4 or 6 or 8 disks, Excuse me. But it means that if you want to upgrade it by either replacing disks or adding more disks, you have to do it in that size of a block. The flexibility of using mirrors is quite nice. But with the ability to expand RAID Z coming up, maybe you go with a RAID Z 2 of however many drives you can afford, and then just wait. And then next year, you'll be able to add more disks to the existing RAID Z.
Yeah, so the approach is good.
I'd recommend against RAID Z 1 because, if you have many disks, the chance of 2 of them failing at once gets pretty high. And you don't want all your data to go bye-bye.
No, not for a backup system. Yeah, in case, I mean, it's a good start using ZFS and all the plans you're doing. It's basically starting out with ZFS. These would be the typical questions. Check out Alan and Michael W. Lucas' first book, at least, on ZFS, the ZFS Mastery. That will give you a lot of information already to get started, and don't do any silly mistakes this way. And this way you can rest sure that you have a ZFS system that is providing you the best possible performance and also the reliability and resiliency to store your data in a safe way.
Yeah. About the tuning stuff, ZFS tries very hard to avoid you needing to tune it. Very much the philosophy is against, magic tunable values that you don't know about. So outside of specific use cases where you might need to tune something like for a database, for the general SSDs in your computer, other than turning compression on and maybe the relative A time, there's not much else you need to worry about.
Yeah, create a Z pool, create a couple of data sets, copy data there. You don't have to fiddle every day or every week on the pool, making settings. ZFS just works. All right, that covers pretty much all the feedback and questions for this week. If you have more for us, and we're already looking for more, send it to feedback@bsdnow.tv, or if you found something interesting that's BSD related, ideas, something that we should cover in future episodes, send this to us. And, of course, we'll cover, once we're back from Asia BSDCon, everything about the conference, the time that we had there. And certainly we'll be back next time for a regular episode after March.
It feels weird to say next week, but if you're watching this when it comes out, it'll actually be next week. It's just 2 weeks away for us.
Yeah, we'll take some time off, but you will still get your dose of BSD Now.